right, thank you guys so much. Sawyer and Alexis, please take the floor.
Thank you, Chanel. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We can get started with introductions. I can go first. Hi, y'all. My name is Solaire Spellin. I'm the Associate Director for the California Preterm Birth Initiative at UCSF. I am a birth justice advocate, leader. I am super, super passionate about this work, about racial equity and racial justice, and just really spreading the knowledge and the strategies and the best practices that we have to be able to move the needle in this work. I'm super passionate about it, and I will get involved in just about anything that has to do with moms and babies. So that's me.
And hey, everyone, my name is Alexis Cobbins. I'm the Executive Director of the California Preterm Birth Initiative and work very closely with Solaire. I'm actually stated we're both birth justice advocates and leaders. I came to this, I'm a social worker by training, so I came to this work through actually providing direct services and like starting to make connections about the system and how it was really impacting people and where could I make changes. And then from my own personal motherhood journey and the discrimination experiences I had, like spurred me into advocacy as well. So that's what we're pleased to be here with you all today. So next slide. I'd like to get into some of the equity practices that we embody at PTBI and just kind of introduce them to you all. You may or may not already do these things at your places of work, but we like to start with a Black ancestor appreciation. I'm going to read it, and I also just want to acknowledge that we do have another version if a non-Black person is reading this appreciation, and these are also things that we can make available to you all if you like them. And also after I read the Black ancestor appreciation, I will go into a land acknowledgement as well. Having these two practices happen at the beginning of all of our connections is very important to us from our equity center lens. So Black ancestor appreciation. We acknowledge the exploitation of our Black ancestors who toiled on this land, building America's wealth and freedom, and survived despite never being compensated and being denied their sovereignty. While our ancestors have survived, we also honor and remember those whose legacies were cut short due to genocidal anti-Black violence. We are committed to repairing the harms caused by individuals, institutions, and the US government, and we honor the gifts, resilience, and sacrifices of our Black ancestors by protecting our spirits, seeking light and laughter, leaning into love, and investing in our collective legacy. This is adapted by the San Francisco's Reparations Advisory Committee. It was edited by the Centering Black Women, Birthing People and Families work group at our organization, and then it was revised by our Community Advisory Board. Next slide. Land acknowledgement, and this is specific to the land that UCSF sits on. So if you wanted to embody this, you would need to, which we can provide resources where you can find out what land your particular organization is on. But we would like to acknowledge the Ramaytush Ohlone people who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Ramaytush Ohlone elders, past, present, and future, who call this place, the land that UCSF sits upon, their home. We are proud to continue their tradition of coming together and growing as a community. We thank the Ramaytush Ohlone community for their stewardship and support, and we look forward to strengthening our ties as we continue our relationship of mutual respect and understanding. Also, what we can provide after this presentation, there are also ways that you can actually give monetarily to the land. So taking it a step further beyond just acknowledging that we're on the land, but also how do we do some form of reparation. So we can provide those links as well. Next slide.
So I'm just going to briefly walk us through our objectives for today, what we're going to go through, what you should expect. We're going to cover a shared understanding of what anti-Blackness is, but also white supremacy. We'll talk about how we move from power hoarding to collective action and community building in this work. We'll talk about what the landscape is looking like in terms of funding for racial equity and racial justice. And then we'll also go over some approaches to combating how they manifest in our work. And we'll have an exercise a challenges and solutions exercise that we'll talk about towards the end. Should lead to some really good discussion. So that's what we're gonna go over in our brief time today. How does that sound to folks? I can only see a few faces, but head nods are cool.
Let us know in the chat. And me and Solaire are relational, so please
Right.
write in the chat. We stand something, write a comment. If you have something to expand upon what we're sharing, please do that as
Yes.
well. I didn't share how my little emoji face, but I was like that little face with the glasses because like I'm eager to share my learning, but I'm also eager to learn from all of you. I know you all have been in this process for a while now, and you all have a lot to share in this space and have a lot of knowledge. And so I feel like this is a discussion more than a presentation. And so we'd really like interaction from you all in the chat or come off mute. I'm really be like, hey, wait, you didn't say this or look, do all that because that will make me feel very good. And
Yes,
really
no,
well
same.
received. It's hard
Same
on
here.
Zoom. It's hard on Zoom with the silence. So I like a more collaborative space.
Same here. Oh my gosh, I don't remember the letter of what mine was, but I was definitely the one that was cheesing like this. 'Cause I'm always excited to do this work and talk about it. It's really important. I'm super passionate about it. And so let's get into it.
All right, next slide. Okay, racism is a spectrum. Can anybody share in the chat, or you can come off mute and shout it out? What do you think I mean by saying that, or what does that mean? What does that statement mean? Does anybody have any thoughts? No, yes, no. Okay, Syria says, okay, I see the comments coming into the chat. Yes, thank you, thank you. And so all of those things, and also just really wanting to highlight that I'm, for the entirety of this presentation, we're speaking to the United States context. That's the only context I have and feel knowledgeable to speak to. But for the United States context, it's racism is a spectrum with white supremacy on one end and anti-Blackness on the other end. And so racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race, right? And that structuring and assigning value unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities while unfairly advantaging other individuals and community. And it saps the strength of us as a whole society through the waste of human resources because we're making all of these judgments about each other based on how we look. And so for the purposes of this conversation, I'm specifically defining or speaking to the definition of white supremacy as the social, economic, and political systems that collectively enable white people to maintain power over people of other races. And I'm defining anti-Blackness in a two-part formation. So it's one, it both strips Blackness of its value, dehumanizes Black people, and systematically marginalizes Black people. And this is an overt form of racism. Society also associates politically incorrect comments with the overt nature of anti-Black racism. And beneath this anti-Black racism is the covert, structural, and systemic racism, which predetermines the socioeconomic status of Blacks in this country and is held in place by anti-Black policies, institutions, and ideologies. Anti-Blackness is also the disregard for Black institutions, policies, and ideologies. And this disregard is the product of class, race, or gender privilege given to certain individuals' experience due to anti-Blackness. And so your experience with racism in the United States is based on your proximity to whiteness or Blackness, and that can be physically and phenotypically, and it can also be class-wise, situational wise. And we're gonna, next slide, we're gonna move into a small clip from Dr. Coretha Mitchell, where she kind of speaks a little bit to how we often will regard whiteness as neutral and how that has actually negative impacts to people of color.
And just gets to be a student. Part of what I want us to get in in the practice of doing is recognize that whiteness is never neutral. It is unfairly advantaged. And so whenever you pretend that it's neutral, you're ignoring the way that there's an unfair advantage. So with the Supreme Court example that you're using, if we act as if being a white person is a neutral thing, then we overlook all of the unearned advantages that came with being white for all of those predecessors. We overlook the way that they didn't have to be exceptional, that they were given exceptional opportunity, even if they weren't exceptional. We could even uncover all the ways that our educational system is advantaging white children from the playground, right? So it's like, if we act like whiteness is neutral, we're already bludgeoning everyone who's of color. So I just want us to get really used to paying attention to the unearned advantage of whiteness that makes it such that every time they're hired, for example, they're hired in a cluster. They get to come in with a whole group of people who are believing in their success, believing in their right to belong. They get to enter into a workplace where people naturally mentor them and don't see it as mentoring. They just see it as being a good colleague. But when I show up, all of a sudden, if they're mentoring me, they're giving me some kind of special help or something. No, they're actually usually resistant to mentoring me and making sure that I can be set up to fail. So I just want us to get really, really practiced at noticing how whiteness gives unearned advantages, and those unearned advantages turn into a bludgeon against people of color.
Right.
The benefit of the doubt that you get when you are white, the benefit of the doubt that leads to 4th, 5th, and 6th chances, the benefit of the doubt that doesn't, like all of those benefits of the doubt based on nothing but whiteness translates into a bludgeon for people of color. And I want us to get really used to noticing that, because then we will notice how easy it is for us to be extra angry at Black women for every little thing. I want us to start recognizing that as part of the aggression. And if I can give one more example.
So let's start that there, and next slide, please. So of course, there's also intersectionality, right? And so intersectionality is an analytical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and or privilege. And so it identifies multiple factors of advantage and disadvantage. And a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw on the slide: intersectionality is simply about how certain aspects of who you are will increase your access to the good things or your exposure to the bad things in life. Next slide, please. And so I really want to talk about Dr. Nimisha Barton and her work. Dr. Nimisha Barton is a Southeast Asian person who has over a decade of experience as an equity practitioner and scholar activist in predominantly white higher education and secondary education settings. But in her work, she draws distinctions between white passing and white adjacent people of color, as well as their investments in whiteness and anti-Blackness, in order to further our collective understanding of how proximity to whiteness surfaces for some people of color in varied and nuanced ways. And so Dr. Barton defines the proximity to whiteness as access to certain forms of power, resources, as well as social, economic, and cultural capital that have been historically constructed to advantage white people in this country at the expense of people of color, generally Black and Indigenous Americans in particular. White passing people of color may visibly pass as white and thus experience entry into the white world on account of certain phenotypical characteristics and skin color above all. But the phenomenon, I want to point out, the phenomenon of being white passing can have little to do with whether a person of color themselves identifies as such as or not. So they may not want to indulge in all of that, what comes with it. But nevertheless, depending on the context, colorism or discrimination against darker skinned people will occasionally bestow access to white privilege upon white passing people of color, whether they want that privilege or not. And white adjacent people of color who are quite visibly non-white may nevertheless occasionally become insiders in the white world as a result of two separate but related factors that Dr. Barton identifies. The first being real or assumed proximity to markers of whiteness, such as wealth, education, and professional status. And secondly, given that this country was socially constructed along a racial spectrum where whiteness and blackness are at polar opposites, it can be your access can be defined by your real or assumed anti-Black beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors. And so as an example of this, Dr. Barton speaks to how we frame the unique racial experience of Asian Americans through the prism of the model minority myth. And in a nutshell, the model minority myth claims that although many Asian Americans have suffered a unique history of violence, exclusion, and disenfranchisement in this country, they have also benefited from positive stereotypes about their minority group, namely that they are intelligent, hardworking, well-behaved, successful. This is a sort of white supremacist divide and conquer strategy. And Dr. Barton also speaks to how she's seen white adjacent people of color conform to whiteness in education settings primarily by engaging and legitimizing anti-Blackness, both implicitly and explicitly among white administrative leaders. And often she feels they do so because they imagine themselves incapable of holding a racist belief by virtue of the fact that they are also people of color. And on other occasions, the anti-Blackness of some white adjacent people of color may remain unchecked because, like many white folks, they don't consider themselves as raced and racialized beings. But like tokenization across the board, people of color white adjacency operates in the service of legitimizing white supremacy and hurting people of color. So 4 things that you can do as a non-Black person of color as you're analyzing this for yourself is to, 1, acknowledge that you are a race being. And for people who feel that race hasn't shaped any of their experiences, or if they're just being made aware, that's actually a sign of how white passing and how white adjacent you are, that you haven't had to think about it. And the longer you go without understanding yourself as a race and racialized being, the more likely you are to do harm to people of color around you, especially Black people, given the pervasiveness of anti-Blackness in our society. 2, you want to develop a nuanced awareness of your racialized identity. So you can seek out different forms of media, books, articles, workshops, documentaries, lectures that document the history of your ethnic or racial group in this country. And it's critical to find educational materials that attend to how your ethnic or racial group was instrumentalized in service of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. But it's also equally important that you don't neglect the parts of your group's history that furnishes models of folks within your community who resisted white supremacy. This is important because it reminds us that we all have access to a progressive anti-racist history and legacy that we can choose to carry forward. 3, you want to learn the unique history of anti-Blackness in this country and the history of anti-Blackness specific to your community. So while 1 and 2 kind of help us look into the past and give context and understand, step 3 is really being aware of the present anti-Blackness that's functioning day to day in our lives. And then 4, attend to the ways in which your white privilege surfaces day to day. So once you have begun steps 1, 2, and 3, you can start to consider the ways that you as a white passing or white adjacent person of color may hold white privilege in your life and consider what that means, what that consequence means. And so an example that she highlights is that trust building may not come immediately with other people of color because you may not look like someone that has been traditionally worthy of their trust, given their experiences. And that this is a savvy survival tool that people of color have developed to help them move through the world. And it helps you become respectful of their boundaries and proceed with warmth, compassion, and empathy, and start to let your actions speak louder than your words, and being mindful of how much space you take up, especially in big tent racial affinity spaces that bring people together under the umbrella of people of color, although we all have very unique experiences depending upon where that lies. And so when we do that, we can move from, next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, I know I have another slide that I'm going to skip past just for time's sake, but that slide was just kind of speaking to the differences when you start to stratify out the Asian American category and how experiences people are having based on their proximity to whiteness and Blackness in terms of health data. But we will provide this at the end. And so we want to move from power hoarding, which is a tactic of white supremacy. And we want to move from that to collective action and community. So power hoarding can show up like little, if any, value around sharing power. power is seen as limited, like there's only so much power to go around, and so people don't want to share it. Those with power feel threatened when anyone suggests changing how things should be done in the organization, and often feeling suggestions for change are a reflection about their leadership. Those with power don't see themselves as hoarding power or as feeling threatening, and those with power assume they have the best interest of the organization at heart and assume those wanting change are just ill-informed, emotional, inexperienced. Moving to collective action is any form of organized social or political act carried about by a group of people in order to address their needs. And so the civil rights movement is like the most visible example of a collective action. It's not the only one. Any form of organized group effort to address some form of inequality may be considered a collective action. And so some other examples are like the women's suffrage movement, the fight for gay and lesbian rights, other issues could be like a community of farmers coming together to agree upon how to best ration water from a common source. And labor unions are another type of collective action that they ensure that businesses are paying fair wages and providing adequate benefits to their employees. And so moving to collective action looks like power sharing as an explicit organizational or community value, discussing and defining what good leadership looks like, including how a good leader can develop the power and skill of others. If you're a leader and or hold power, understanding that change is inevitable and challenges to your leadership are often healthy and productive. You can adopt a tell me more approach when people are identifying challenges and bringing that to you. If you're a leader and hold power, avoid taking challenges personally and return to the principle of collective thinking and action, asking for help with your leadership, particularly when you're feeling defensive. If you're a leader and hold power, realizing your ability and responsibility to support others to hold power well and responsibly. You want to support others in being successful and helping them shine. You want to mentor them, and you want to realize that your ability to support and help others grow reflects well on you. Also allowing yourself to feel joy in helping others grow, thrive, succeed, and even exceed, getting out of that competition mode. But how do I help this person shine? There's enough room for all the stars in the sky to shine, right? And you want to lean into racial equity principles, such as knowing yourself, and develop strategies for making friends with your ego so that you're leading and acting from a place of integrity rather than fear or anxiety. And when I say knowing yourself, it's like taking action for racial justice requires a level of self-awareness that allows us to be clear about what we're called to do, what we know how to do, and where we need to develop. And another way of thinking about this is knowing our strengths and our weaknesses, our opportunities for growth and our challenges. And knowing ourselves means that we can show up to work knowing we're skilled and confident, and where we need to learn and are sitting with a lot of not knowing, and where we need to ask for help or admit that we don't know what we're doing. And knowing ourselves means that we're feeling and taking responsibility for those feelings rather than assuming it's the group of the job to take care of us. So next slide, please.
Thank you, Alexis. So now we're going to talk about how this manifests in the funding landscape. So let's start here. Can anyone tell me the difference between racial equity and racial justice? You can put it in the chat. You can tell me in general what's the difference, or in the context of philanthropy. You can even come off mute and share. Yep, justice brings equity a step further. Absolutely. I'm sure folks have seen that image of, equality, equity, justice, what that looks like and the differences there. Yep. Good. Yes. So the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, or PRE, says that funding with a racial equity lens analyzes data and info about race and ethnicity, understands the racial disparities, why they exist, and the structural root causes, and names race explicitly about it. Racial justice, however, adds an understanding of the racial history, a shared vision of an inclusive society, and what I find to be personally the most important distinction, it focuses on building power and transformative solutions by those most impacted. Racial equity is actually one part of racial justice, like somebody said in the chat. It's one part of the puzzle, right? And so when we don't focus on elements of racial justice, we tend to stop at just looking at, preventing harm and redistributing benefits, which is incredibly important. But we must couple that with eliminating the policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that actually reinforce differential outcomes by race. And we also must include dimensions of power building and transformative goals, like Alexis was sharing, right? We have to generate enough power among disenfranchised people to change the fundamental rules of society. And we have to do it in a sustainable, long-term way. Racial injustice is the result of centuries of harm. And so it's going to take more than a one-time, one-year grant, right, to actually drive the change that we're looking to see. We are essentially talking about the difference between working on improved outcomes within the existing system and building power, building community power to fight for deep transformational change of the major systems. That's the difference. I really encourage everyone to read the report by PRI. It's called Mismatched. They make many insights, and they actually bring us to the reality of what's going on as it relates to funding for racial equity and racial justice, and how it impacts the ways we see our work and how we carry out our work. And I'll just list some of them here. The first is that funding for racial equity and justice remains a small portion of overall foundation funding, and it does not meet the scale of the disparities that we see. And although there's certainly been an uptick in the amount of funding in these areas over the last few decades, it's inadequate to move the needle in the ways that it needs to move. They also pointed out that there are a small amount of funders that dedicate resources to racial equity and justice funding. And so that leads to this over-reliance on particular funders, and that makes grantees really vulnerable to funder interests, as you can imagine. The second is the rise in funding for racial equity was not an overnight occurrence. This didn't happen overnight, but has actually grown slow and steady over time. The hyped up, media narrative that it just happened overnight due to recent injustices, that's actually harmful. That narrative is actually harmful because it erases the hard work that our predecessors engaged in to get to the point that we're at right now. And it also sets up a false pretense and unrealistic expectation of organizations that have not been adequately resourced to date. And again, that makes them vulnerable to narratives about communities of color being undeserving of funding because we're not set up to do it right. And it also discourages other funders and peddles this other false narrative that racial justice work is well funded. And so they'll fund something else when actually that's not the reality. Next is the co-optation of movement language. It is widespread, and it is used to advance projects that are not at all responsive to the movement's call. And I think you could see where we're going with this one. Predominantly white-led orgs will and do use movement language to walk through those foundation doors that were opened by Black, Brown, and Indigenous justice leaders and activists, and they will raise money for their DEI efforts and recruitment, but that doesn't build power with or in those communities of color. And similarly, wealthy white donors in particular impose their own priorities rather than supporting the priorities of the movement. So many philanthropists believe they know what's right, they know what's going to fix the problem, or that they have better solutions than activists do, but we know that when those that are most impacted by the issue are minimally or not involved at all, that leads to these Band-Aid solutions that have minimal or no impact, while the organizers in the communities that do have the solutions go underfunded. That's what ends up happening. And then lastly, justice movement building in general, that funding remains pretty low. Remaining within this equity framework and only focusing on increasing opportunities, meeting these short-term needs, Band-Aid solutions, it does not lead to the long-term movement building, systems change work that is actually needed to move the needle. And given that the majority of this kind of funding is equity-based, we believe there's a disconnect between what the funders know about power and the winning ability of organizing work. We know that that works, but there is this disconnect. I'll just go a little bit faster. So this slide is just showing the percent of funds that are for specific racial ethnic groups. We know that more than a third of the top 20 racial equity and justice orgs that are funded are white-led orgs. And the remaining is pretty sporadic, the way it's distributed amongst communities of color. As you can see here, for example, the blue, Black-led orgs, even after Ferguson in 2014, the percent goes up, but then decreases, right, despite our movements to date. And it actually never reaches 2%. And you see a similar trend for Indigenous communities, despite movements like Standing Rock, the percent never exceeds 1.5%. Despite that, there is definitely hope. We've seen it firsthand. Philanthropists, grant makers, researchers, activists, they have been working together. After seeing reports that come out, after seeing the data, they have been working on creating new models that will work better for this. But of course, there's the expectation, and then there's the reality. So it is story time. The examples I'm about to share with you all are actually real life existing funders and examples that we have experienced firsthand. And so we thought maybe some of you might be able to relate. So Funder A puts out a proposal with a health disparities focus. They require that grantees have a racial equity component, but they do not require racial equity experience. Therefore, they are having little to no influence or accountability. And so you can just imagine, you know, what might happen in a situation like this. This type of model risks causing harm, as you can imagine. So you're bringing on grantees that have no experience doing this kind of work. You're funding them to do this kind of work, and then you're relying on them to tell you how to do it. The start is already flawed, right? Without requiring that expertise, that background, you're already risking causing more harm than good with this proposal. Funder B, also health disparities focused. They require that grantees have a racial equity component. They require racial equity experience, and they suggest some resources to be used. They actually use language from the paper I hope you all read, Racism as a Root Cause, a New Approach. They use that to design their proposal questions. But again, they suggested some resources, but did not actually dedicate additional resources to support this work. So there's sort of medium level influence and accountability. And so what does that lead to? It leads to a high burden on grantees. When you are expecting folks to do this kind of work, like it's good, but there's this phenomenon that we're seeing where they are requiring a ton on the grantee end that the grantees aren't necessarily set up to provide. And so therefore the funding ends up going to more robust, typically white-led orgs. And that's not really what we need to see, right? Based on what we're talking about. And then Funder C, again, a health disparities focused proposal. They required grantees to have a racial justice component, and they required racial equity experience. And Funder C actually had an expectation of the grantee to organize the top 10 submitting orgs to carry out the work with a more justice-oriented approach, but they didn't include additional funding to support that. And so the grantee actually pushed back and negotiated, and I'll talk more about that strategy in a bit, because when you do things like that, if that grantee wasn't willing to push back and talk about the ways that they might be able to change this, that would risk this work staying in the equity space when really they're trying to move into the justice space. I hope you're able to see what I'm setting up here. And so some new approaches to doing this work, pre the org that I've been talking about, they also put out recommendations for ways that grant makers can improve, which folks can take a look at if you're interested. We'll share the link, but for orgs like us, what can we do? What can we do? So we talked about the difference between racial justice and racial equity work. We can really take a look at the work that we're doing and decide, take a look and see, is it racial equity? Do we want to move it to racial justice, right? Collaboration, not competition. That's the title of this presentation. This is what we're striving to do. The competition is not the answer. We need to collaborate together if we want to make some moves on what we're trying to do. We also need to demystify the scarcity mentality and assess risk accurately and honestly. We also need to challenge the status quo. So the person that went back to that funder, when they pushed back, they were trying to negotiate for additional funding or additional time to do this work because they knew that they weren't going to be able to meet those goals based on how it was set up. And so we need to get brave and be willing to negotiate in situations like this.